Alright, so we're doing Georgism or land value tax, probably Georgism, because we're going to discuss, I think, Bogovian and severance taxes also. I think first we should probably establish what Georgism is as a baseline. I sort of have an idea. I mean, the way I describe it is Georgism. It doesn't necessarily. So there's different types of Georgism, which depends on sort of how you spend. But all Georgists agree on how we should tax, which is you should tax non-reproducible goods. So obviously the most famous form of this is the land value tax. But Georgists obviously also argue for taxes on oil or gold or etc. Just or less taxes on oil and gold and more tax on extraction of these resources, because once they're extracted, they obviously you're limiting the supply that you can extract. So to summarize, it's Georgism is a tax on non-reproducible goods. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, it's essentially a school of thought that, as you were saying, aims to tax natural resources and things that aren't producible. And as you were saying, that can consist of land value taxes, but it can also consist of all these other taxes that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, like
uh,
the severance tax.
yeah, which is of course a tax on the extraction of resources. And there's also Pagovian taxes, which some Georgists argue for, which is a tax on externalities. So if you had so a good example is the tobacco tax, right? You tax tobacco because it creates a negative externality on the healthcare system in the form of like lung cancer and things like that, which cost the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what Georgism is, and in its simplest form. And so now we'll discuss why land value tax is the perfect tax. So Georgists advocate for this for the main reason that land value tax it's essentially the best tax of any tax, and that's because it's the only tax that doesn't create economic inefficiencies, and in fact, it does the opposite. It boosts economic efficiencies by forcing more thoughtful investment, I suppose, and reducing speculation.
Yeah, I
Question.
would also add that it also
Oh,
minimizes burdens that come from taxation,
Yeah,
or at least they're more minimal.
yeah.
so what's the difference in terms of efficiency of a land value tax and let's say a Progovian tax that taxes externalities?
So a
Negative.
Pagovian
Right.
tax just it doesn't inhibit consumption. You can still consume the same, but it increases the cost of consumption. A Pagovian tax, right? And so
Yeah.
that does create some negative, some economic efficiencies in the form of inflation and things like that. Whereas land value tax can actually be deflationary because, of course, it reduces the cost of ground rents by forcing speculators out of market.
Yeah. Okay.
I would
Fair
also
enough.
add that that land value taxes also have a very similar effect as expansionary monetary policy in that it lowers interest rates and is done intentionally to boost economic activity.
Yeah. So well,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the exact same. Obviously,
no, of
expansionist
course not.
monetary,
No.
expansionist monetary policy focuses more on developing capital, whereas land value tax focuses more on reallocating capital. I would argue.
Although, land value taxes also encourage new capital investment, although it is not exactly the priority and it's instead to create a more equitable society, it does also encourage investment and it boosts aggregate demand within the economy, I would say,
Yeah. Okay. So on that,
even if that's
um,
not the main priority.
yeah. So on that, we should probably discuss why Henry George argues for, sorry, Henry George's sort of his breakthrough theory, which was that. So before Henry George came along, there was sort of the idea that capital, capital is created in two ways, which is labor and capital, which is investment in and of itself. And then Henry George comes along and he says land is also a factor of production and in itself creates capital. And his main crux of the argument was land it generates capital, but it only generates capital on the back of labor and capital itself through investment. And so therefore, by essentially owning land, you're monopolizing the capital of the economy, and so therefore high land value doesn't represent an efficient economy. If anything, all it does is represent inequality.
And it is interesting because Abraham Lincoln, who died like right before Henry George was born, he had a very interesting quote that was basically along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, um, yeah, the land, the earth God gave to man for his home should never be the possession of any man, corporation, or society any more than the air or water.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
George obviously had a Henry George, I believe, in Our Land and Land Policy, which was his book before Progress and Poverty, which is his main book. He takes an almost religious aspect to it in that, like, God created the land and everything, and it is to allow a human to own the land is almost sacrilege. Um, so there's that argument also if you want to take a religious aspect, but I mean the reason land value tax is I mean okay, so there's two arguments for land value tax. I've got two main arguments, and that is obviously it's just the most economically efficient, and then there's also the more social aspect, which is that is it really morally correct to allow people to own land? Because if you think about it, right, if you own land now, you have a first mover advantage in that future. You're essentially taxing future generations because you're taking away their ability to get on the property ladder and to own land and things like this. And so we see that hugely reflected in the modern day with the housing crisis. And the housing costs have gone up exponentially, and I believe in the UK, which is where I have most of my data on, almost 60%, if not more, of a house's value is in the land that it's on. And so because of that, obviously we have these very, very high barriers to entry to build housing. And that is also somewhat to do with our land use policy and things like that, which Georgists also advocate for. A lot of Georgists are YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. So there's also the policy aspect of land value tax, is that you can have a land value tax, but it isn't. Its efficiency is almost limited by the land policy itself.
yeah, and on the topic of that, I would say that another limit to the land value taxes themselves are the fact that land, and this is a very common argument against them, is notoriously difficult to apply value to and to quantify. Um, which obviously means that because of that, because of the idea that land is something that's very hard to give an exact number to, as opposed to say labor or capital, that makes it much more difficult to tax, or at least that's the mindset that a lot of politicians and a lot of policymakers have.
Yeah, I see that as the main argument. Also, I mean, the biggest argument against Georgism is as you just described, is that it's difficult to value land. But honestly, I feel that's quite a weak argument, right? When we first tried
Yeah, I
to,
was
I mean,
going
in
to
the
agree then.
sorry, what did you say?
I was going to say the same. I think that's a weak argument
Yeah,
in
so
some retrospect.
yeah, so when we tried to introduce land value tax in the UK, in the 1910s, it fell through simply because of a land registry failed to. I mean, this isn't the only reason. World War One played a big part, but another reason is the land registry failed to find very very accurate values of land and things like that. But I think in the modern day, where we have, essentially every square inch of the UK mapped out with satellite imagery, and we have a constantly updated system of the land registry, completely online, completely digitalized, and on top of that, also landlords are a very good mechanism to establishing land value tax, because landlords buy. I mean, it's in the name. Landlords, they own the land. By renting this land out, they're inherently setting a value for this land, right? So I honestly find the land valuation argument to be somewhat of a weak one, because I mean the free market has already dictated the value of this land. Now all you do is put a 5% tax on it, and it corrects itself and pushes speculators out of market. Of course, if speculators want to stay in market, and they want to sell this land, then when they sell the land, they'll have to admit the value of that land, and then suddenly they're going to have to owe all these taxes. So
I would just like to add, we currently have land valuation estimates already for like stuff like council tax and stamp duty. So
well, okay, that's
it's
on
not like we
property.
don't
This
have it.
is so this is it. You raise a good point, but also a very bad point, because that's property value. This is the thing you need to. This is a big thing you need to understand with land value tax, and this is why a lot of Georgists like to use the saying universal building exemption, because you tax the land, not the property. Because if you tax the property, you're inhibiting, development of the land, right? If you tax a £100,000 house, rather than the land that it's on, if you then increase that house's value to £150,000 through development, suddenly you'll have to pay more tax because you developed the house. It doesn't make sense, right? If you tax the value of the land, what happens is that land value increases because of its proximity to other developments, right? So obviously land in London is worth a lot more than land in the middle of the Yorkshire Moors, simply because it has a proximity to all of these job opportunities and public services and things like that. And so by taxing the land itself, you're not inhibiting development. All you're doing is reducing the free rider problem, for example.
Yeah, no, I'm completely on board with that, and I do agree that there's a lot of benefit that comes when you apply these LBTs on more concentrated areas, since that, as we're saying, gets rid of the free rider problem and also establishes a much more equitable and more sustainable way of life by having it so that landlords don't have to hoard and own. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a lot of within the real estate market, landlords do own quite a lot of assets of land. Um, and that has led to, as we're saying, uh, really, really high costs of living. And the whole idea with Georgist policy and with land value taxes is to reduce those costs of living by directly taxing the problem.
Yeah. So but then obviously the thing about land value tax is then, so you raise all this money from land value tax, and you get the benefits of incentivizing development rather than hindering income. So because obviously the main idea with Georgism is that a land value tax could be a single tax. It could replace income tax. It could replace corporation tax, which are all taxes that somewhat disinhibit economic activity. Inhibit economic activity. But then where do you spend all this money is a conundrum you sort of go into. And Henry George argues for a citizen's dividend, which is you would have all of you, or you had all, so you have government expenditure, right? Because he still argued for public services like public transport and things like that. But then you'd expect a bit of a surplus because of just how efficient the land value tax is, and you would essentially just take the surplus, divide it by the population, and then give out that money to absolutely everyone. And that could even, for example, replace welfare payments, right? Because now you don't need this huge bureaucracy system where you're having to pay everyone different rates based on everything. You could just flat out pay everyone this, and yeah. I mean, arguably that does have its downsides. Elon Musk probably shouldn't be being paid as much citizens' dividend as a homeless person in Baltimore, but I mean, to an extent, it's a lot more progressive than what we have right now.
Yeah, I was about to add, the way you were describing it was not exactly what a lot of progressive taxes promote, but it just comes from the natural result, as we're saying, from these Georgist and land value taxes. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit tired today. I've been doing a lot of things. I had some IKEA furniture come in, so I'm sorry if I'm not exactly on top of my economic A game today.
All good, all good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question on that. If let's say you paid this out like as a person's dividend, would that not end up centralizing a lot of money distribution towards cities and stuff, which would make a disparity between, let's say, like a village and a city in terms of how much redevelopment they get?
I mean, you make that argument, but also that's the reason it is like that is because a lot of land value is centered in cities, and this is something I want to get to with another argument against Georgism is that it'll disproportionately hurt farmers, right? And a lot of people make this argument. A lot of people I've spoke to included, and that's because they have this idea that farmland is worth X amount and farmland only generates this much capital, and the big mistake I guess let me just give some figures, right? In the UK, about an acre of farmland is about £10,000. Pre-2008, it was about £2,000. So somehow farmland has gone up 5 times in value, despite the fact, crop yield value has significantly not represented that. And I think that's primarily due to speculation. So obviously a land value tax would inhibit speculation. So already the value of this land would go down. So the proportion that farmers are paying is less, because land value tax is levied as a percentage of the land value. So many Georgists argue for an 100% one. That's very difficult to implement instantly. So I think more realistic figures are probably about 2.5 to 5%. That's how most systems in the world operate. I think Estonia is 1.5%. I think Denmark is 2% in these semi-Georgist systems, which are often council taxes, not state-led. And so anyway, so you have like a 2.5% land value tax. That is immediately going to make people who are just buying land for speculation purposes want to sell it off, because they bought the land because there's no inherent cost. You just hold on to it. When there's a tax, there is an inherent cost. So you're incentivized to sell the land and invest it into more productive means. And ultimately, what I'm getting to with this is that farmland, which is what people always go to as the crux of the argument, is actually, if anything, it benefits from it because it becomes cheaper. And what happens, if you look at all farmers in the UK, 64% of farms are tenant farmers, which means they don't own the land outright. They're actually renting the farmland from, either a building society or other land speculators, or even in the UK, this is a very unique thing, aristocracy, because 30% of land in the UK is owned by aristocracy who just hold on to it because it's in their estate. It seems almost ridiculous. And they pay no tax on these estates very often, because we don't even have an estate tax. So anyway.
Well,
Sorry.
I was just going to say, that perfectly debunks a common argument that people have, that these land value taxes are detrimental to farmers because they're in areas that are not so concentrated by all this productivity and all this opportunity. And I feel like you explained it very well.
Yeah, so the point I was getting to, though, ultimately, is that because a lot of farmers are tenant farmers, relying on, building societies or aristocracy or whatever, renting out their land, with a land value tax, they are now paying less rent because the speculation value has decreased. And on top of that, in fact, a lot of these landlords who the farmers are renting off of will now want to sell off their land. So that gives the farmers the opportunity to then buy the land, which is reducing their overheads because they're spending less on rent, right? They can now take all this capital and immediately invest it into more productive means.
More productive means, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whether that's
We said it like at the same time.
Yeah.
Question.
So whether that's more mechanized, more mechanized agricultural techniques or better fertilizers or whatever. I mean, overall, it's going to increase their productivity while also reducing their overheads.
Yep. If you decrease not property prices like directly, but let's say you introduce a land value tax and property prices as a result decrease, would that not decrease a chunk of national wealth on paper? And then furthermore, like just fleshing this thought out, if property prices decrease, wouldn't that have a pretty big effect on, let's say, like credit ratings and banking collateral? Like how would that change on a balance sheet in proportion to the long-term efficiency benefits?
Yeah, so obviously, we discussed this on, I believe, the first episode with Hard Money. A lot of these economic systems are on paper are very efficient. The transition period is very, very hard. And that's why with land value tax, of course, we argue for very small percentages at first. As I said, about 2.5 to 5% is probably that golden area where it's not a huge amount, but it generally captures the interest of land, right? Because land generally appreciates in value by about 4 to 5% each year. So by taxing it at that rate, you're essentially not capping the exact value of land, but you're capturing that extra added value. So obviously that would immediately collapse property values, and so a lot of people would need to refinance and things like that. But also it would have that added benefit of allowing people onto the property ladder. Obviously, there's the proportion of people renting in the UK is only growing more and more and more. And so by having these property values collapse, you can have people actually achieve the property ladder. And I think obviously we have in the UK we have a stamp duty tax on property. In my view, land value tax would replace that, and what that would do is create a more liquid real estate market. In the idea that with stamp duty, you pay it every time you buy a house, right? So you're basically disincentivized from downscaling because the moment you sell your house, not only do you have to obviously pay tax on selling the house, you then have to pay tax on buying a new house, etc., etc. In a land value tax system, you're actually incentivized to sell the house and downscale because ultimately then you're going to pay less tax as a whole, right? So
Yeah.
you would
And
have a
this goes back to what we were saying earlier, about the whole fact that the burdens are removed with the land value taxes that would be there otherwise.
yeah, exactly. So you're reducing
Yeah.
economic burdens and then also making it so that people are incentivized. So you're essentially correcting economic inefficiencies in land hoarding and speculation. And by doing that, yeah, you'll have a brief moment of sort of economic shock as on paper wealth goes down, although in reality it's actually just caused by selling off of property. So the wealth is still there, it's just not locked up in land anymore. Um, and so yeah, on paper wealth would massively decrease, but over time that would the capital would be reallocated and the economy would correct itself. And then, as I just described, you would have almost this mass downscaling of people, and suddenly it's not the trendy thing to do, but the rational thing to do. And we assume people are rational. You would
Question.
hope. So hang on, let me just finish this point. So basically, what would happen is yes, property values would crash, but now you have a sudden influx of people getting onto the property ladder and building their own personal wealth. So you would have actually almost a redistributive effect of wealth equality, correcting itself because people are getting onto the property ladder, they're building their own personal wealth. With obviously home ownership is the biggest share of wealth among most people. So national wealth may drop, but wealth equality would massively increase. And in the long run, wealth as a whole would increase.
Would you agree that one aspect of Georgism is that you want to increase people's liberties in terms of money, not being so tied up in rich people hoarding wealth?
Yes, so that's sort of getting into the different forms of Georgism. So the one of the
As
foremost,
furthermore to this question,
yeah. So
uh,
the foremost thing I was going to get to is there's a thing called geo libertarianism, short for Georgism and libertarianism, in that essentially the geo-libertarians argue for the government should have have a 100% land value tax, so that land is treated as more of a common and is based more on who actually deserves the land based on their income rather than inheritocracy. And so and then obviously just redistribute all the government money through a citizen's dividend. So you have a complete free market. It's just more regulated with land value tax to disincentivize land hoarding to actually promote more capital development. And so,
I
sorry.
No, sorry. I was just gonna say, by completely having a libertarian approach and making land an entire common, this will probably lead to things such as the tragedy of the commons and greater exploitation of these natural resources. If, the libertarians are proposing as little government intervention as possible, besides 100% LBT.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that is a bit of a problem, I would say, and probably why I don't think that geo-libertarianism could work out. But that's just my reading of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think geo-libertarianism is very, I mean, as libertarianism is always like this. It's very overly optimistic and assumes all of these more nuanced factors sort of either don't exist or are a lot less important than they actually are. But as I was getting to, is a land value tax system under geo-libertarianism would arguably be the most fair free market compared to a completely zero tax, zero anything free market.
um, question.
Yeah.
So one of the arguments against a land value tax is that people who, let's say, pensioners have saved up their whole life, worked their whole life, and they've built, not built, well, built, or let's say they saved up and bought a large house, but then as they're a pensioner, they've then got a low income. Would you not say it's an infringement on their own right
Yeah,
to
I'm
live in
so
a house
happy you made
they
this
bought
point. I'm
for?
so happy you made this point. Okay, so
Oh,
everyone who makes this argument, they picture, this old woman, she's worked her entire life, she's got all her wealth tied up in a big mansion, she's worked very hard for this. Okay, now picture the other side of a population, right? These the youth, right, who literally find it completely impossible to be able to build enough wealth to save enough income because it's all going towards rents and things like that to even feasibly imagine being able to do that, as this old woman was able to do in her life, right? Or this old man, or whatever. I mean, the old widow is born that everyone always brings up against Georgism. So the fact that that person could even do that is impossible to imagine in the modern day. And that isn't because we used Georgism in the past. That's primarily due to the fact that everything was a lot cheaper in the past because we had a lot of property building and things like that. And in the UK especially, that's primarily thanks to the government building all this new property and things. So, I mean, I get your argument, but also, I mean, it's an extremely privileged background, and also the fact that this person has worked for entire life and accrued all this wealth just to build a big house. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, right? Sell the house, you can still downscale to a relatively nice house, and then you still have all of this wealth to spend on, more fulfilling things than just owning a big house and essentially, punishing young people I mean, just being that, right? Being younger.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
what
This whole
question?
entire concentration of wealth within this specific asset would kind of limit not only your future generations' economic possibilities, but it would also limit your own endeavors, because all of the money is basically going to be funneled into
hmm.
this single asset.
So the
Could you
argument
clarify something for me?
for what did you say?
Um, can you clarify this? With a land value tax, would you get taxed more in a city or less in a city?
You would get, I mean, compared to what? Compared to outside of a city in rural areas?
Yeah, yeah. Would a
Obvious,
rural area be taxed more or less?
of course, you'd get taxed more in a city because the land value is worth more. It's
So
proportional
then,
to the land
okay.
value.
Question then: if a pensioner in a city then moved out of like said massive house, who would then want to take up such a financial burden? Otherwise, it
Um,
would not just become a derelict house.
well, of course, the state can seize it, and then obviously now the state has some form of wealth. Obviously, there's always going to be someone wanting to buy it for some amount of money, right? Even if this old pensioner sold it for a massively reduced market rate, uh, like someone is inevitably going to want to buy it, and even then, you can make the argument in a land value tax system that I described, where we transition to it slowly by introducing maybe a 1% and 2% and 3% each year. They would have enough time to be able to sell off the house for a decent rate. And I mean, that's sort of a fair argument in that not necessarily everyone is going to want to buy it, but someone is going to have a high enough annual income to be able to buy it and hold on to it. And if not, as I said, the state can seize it and then do something more efficient with it. I mean, if in this system where you're describing a huge mansion, a lot of that is going to be from like landed gentry and aristocracy in the UK, which is in the first place they already have a lot of capital elsewhere. So I always find this mansion argument to be very American centric, and even then in an American system, someone is going to want to buy it because I mean America is just so like capital orientated, right? A lot of
Yeah, and that
American.
leads to a lot greater amount of inequality, and with like a Lorenz curve, it just completely elongates that gap, and that's why I think that a lot of the people who are against LBTs are also the ones who make these sort of comparisons with like the mansions and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, basically by criticizing land value tax for its unfairness on people who own mansions, it just shows a fundamental lack of understanding of the other 90% of a population who themselves are struggling to even own a single house, let alone like a multi-acre estate with a mansion on it.
Yeah, talk about a lack of social awareness.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I mean, as I said, also with a land value tax, it would replace stamp duty, and it would just make a like a more liquid market, a more liquid housing and real estate market. And so, it's not too difficult to downscale, and anyone who would want to upscale can now do that at a massively reduced rate. Because I mean, it's almost impossible to think of anyone our age buying a mansion, but 50, 60 years ago, potentially even longer, further in the past from that, it wasn't unfeasible, right? You could work a very high end job, you could make smart investments, you could save, and you could potentially buy a large estate if you so wanted. Now, it's impossible to do that in a traditional career. You have to become a multi-billionaire through fucking AI stocks or whatever.
Or just being born from wealth, which seems to be the easiest pathway.
Exactly, as I mentioned earlier, the inheritocracy is a big issue.
Yeah.
You basically have to rely on your parents passing you down something to be able to get on a property ladder now. I believe Rory Sutherland is a great guy to watch on this. As a whole, I mean, Rory Sutherland, Georgism in YouTube, but he knew this woman who had a 3.2 million pound house, but her children couldn't afford even their own rents. And it's like, I mean, those children, I mean, the obvious thing to do if you're that child is you just take on a bunch of debt, live off that debt, and wait for your parents to die rather than actually earn an honest living, because it just makes more sense.
Yeah, that's like some Succession shit right there.
Yeah, exactly. When the rational thing to do in the modern economy is basically wait on your parents' death rather than work on, building your own income or generating more capital. It just shows that the economy is fundamentally broken and is oriented more on demographics than actual development.
Yeah, and I would say this is especially the case with, as we're saying, the more capital-oriented societies and the ones that are inherently libertarian in nature, such as, again, the United States.
Hmm.
Whereas if you look at other areas such as Spain, it's not exactly a land value tax, but the prime minister, for lack of a better word, of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, implemented a 100% tax on a 100% progressive tax on rent for people with like the mansions of the really like the 1%, the rich people. And he's a lot more of a social democrat, so he believes in these sort of things. And I think it's just interesting to see the comparison between how that sort of inequality gap is being bridged there in a less capital-oriented society than it is in the United States. And it's a real apples to oranges comparison.
Well, in the UK, we have that in Wales, for example. I know there's some councils that have a 100% tax on second home ownership. And that's obviously slightly different to land value tax because you're taxing the property. And as I mentioned, there's a big distinction in that is when you tax property, you're you're disincentivizing actual development. Or all you're doing is disincentivizing home ownership, which arguably hits landlords and it hits speculation, but it doesn't. But as I said, it also hits development, which is why land value tax is better. It hits speculation and it hits all of these other things, but it also doesn't hit economic efficiencies or development.
No, it doesn't alleviate the pain that would come from, having to own these assets.
Hmm.
The burden, if it doesn't lift that. But I will just say, on the topic of separating the land value from property value, this is one of the biggest arguments from the professor of economics at Dartmouth, which is William. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. William Fischel, who basically said that one of the impractical elements of land value taxes is the fact that it's very difficult to separate the land value from the property value, and this is what you were just saying, as they are inherently different.
Hmm. Yeah, well, to an extent, but also it's not too difficult to. I mean, okay, so for example, one way to figure out the actual property value is, I mean, this is purely a business rate sort of thing. You wouldn't be able to do this with home ownership because it would be based on personal income. But on a business rate idea, is all you do to find the value of a property is you simply find the amount of capital that the property itself generates, because land never generates capital unless you're extracting resources from it, which is a different story. And also you would tax that through severance taxes. But anyway,
Yeah.
so
Oh, we haven't even talked about those yet.
no, yeah, I was gonna get to that next.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's sort of a good transition. So the it's not too difficult to find exact property taxes, and also to an extent, land value isn't impossible to separate from property taxes, simply because land value actually, in a weird way, gets its value from the surrounding property itself, right? So you can sort of figure out land value by looking at maybe brownfield sites in cities and looking at the brownfield site value compared to the value of actual built upon sites. So you can extract sort of you can extract land value tax rates by figuring out the raw value of the land by just looking at the raw value of the land in areas that have no buildings, which isn't. I mean, arguably that creates economic efficiencies by eventually, but obviously land value tax is going to incentivize building on that site. But by the time land value tax is implemented, you have a rough idea of land values, and as I said on on farming, once you sell that land, you sort of admit the value of it and therefore have to pay the taxes.
Yes, and that's what we were saying. That's why a lot of the arguments against LVTs kind of fall flat, because if you're saying you can't add a value to land, you can't put a quantifiable number, and then you sell it, you do actually put a number on it.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's sort of the contradictory nature of those arguments.
I mean, the primary issue with that is, of course, let's say you hold on to land for 10 years and say, oh, it's only valued at £1,000, and then ultimately you sell it for £10,000, and then you can argue, oh, it only gained that value in the last year for whatever reason. But I mean, all you would have to do is look at surrounding land usage and look at the rates of development, and you could very easily tell, oh, that isn't real. That person has just been doing tax avoidance, and then now they have a large tax bill. So
Yeah, no,
there is arguably the hit to government revenue in the short term, but in the long term, when people start selling property, the government revenue starts to flow in very quickly.
Yeah, which I mean, I would say in the long run, ceteris paribus, government revenue doesn't usually hurt. And as you were saying, that could be used to funnel that revenue into more productive and more economically efficient means, such as, it could pay for subsidies, it could pay for public services. There's so many possibilities that can be taken with these by imposing these LVTs and by sort of managing a much more equal and equitable um, land ownership system.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I'm sort of
question.
torn. Hang on, let me just finish saying this. I'm sort of torn on where we should spend the money on. I think personally we should implement that land value tax and simply use it to replace other taxes. Because I think
Yeah, that's what a lot of people argue, that like LVTs are sort of the one dose fits all of all taxes, and that we don't need any other taxes because those create burdens and those create issues.
yeah,
So yeah.
so I think if you introduce the land value tax, the first thing you should do is use it to reduce other taxes and not spend elsewhere. So yeah, I know. Carry on, Ben. Would
Yeah,
you
but that
say?
would also reduce government revenue.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
you increase the land value tax, is it not inevitable that short term you would just see a net decrease in the economic health? Let me flesh this out. Because let's say you introduce the land value tax, let's say 15%. Initially, to set up the structure of the land value tax, there would be a very high temporary cost to it. And then during that time, there's a massive redistribution of wealth, which would that not just create a massive halt in the economy?
Well, obviously not, because people are going to still need to buy food and other things, and people are still going to go to work, and so money is still going to circulate. It's just more a large transfer of wealth, right?
Yeah, but I mean, governmentally wise, like when you're transitioning into a land value tax system, would the government not struggle in terms of, like, for example, investment and such? How would you then redistribute? So let's say there's a fixed cost of implementing a land value tax, just like let's say servers and whatnot. How would you then prioritize that before you get the revenue from it over, like, let's say, public transport and roads and that type of stuff?
Well, I mean, obviously the government would just have a upfront cost, but I mean, the government already runs a deficit. What is another few billion on servers and some more civil servants going to do, right? The cost of implementation, I believe, is so astronomically low, at least in relation to current government revenues and spendings. It's really an insignificant point. You know what I mean?
I mean,
For what
yeah,
it's
you
worth,
can
I
argue
know
that.
what you mean.
Um,
Thank you. Yeah, no, but like, I get what you're saying, but again, you made this point earlier, right? We have a land registry and we already have land values, so the government can just take that data and execute it, right? There's not a massive cost. I feel like, give one autistic person a week and a computer, they could probably do it themselves, right?
Well, I
Yeah,
mean, given us,
hyperbole there, but
yeah.
Huh. So is that everything on land value tax? Can we move to Pagovian and severance taxes now? I don't think that'll take as long. But...
No, because those are, much less documented, I would say, because they follow a lot of the same things, except instead of taxing land, they tax these other natural resources, mining minerals, natural gas, coal, oil, all that jazz.
So a Pagovian tax is a tax on externalities. So as I described earlier, smoking, you would tax for purchasing of tobacco products, which can then be redistributed to healthcare and things like that. And in a geo-libertarian system, I've seen some geo-libertarians argue for this. You do have a Pagovian tax on things that do hurt health, and then you just redistribute that as health credits, which is sort of interesting. I would argue for public healthcare myself, but anyway, and then
I
obviously,
would too.
yeah, and
Because
then
I mean, as an American or as someone who spent a lot of time in the United States, I'm not the biggest fan of the whole mixed healthcare system that the U.S. has, and I understand this is the case because everything's privatized and it's very capital oriented. But I am completely on board with you that public healthcare is really a priority and it's something that needs to be focused on a lot more, not just just in general in the Western world and the Eastern as well.
yeah. I think most people can agree to public healthcare anyway. But so anyway, the point
Yeah,
I was saying is, and then severance taxes, right, is a tax on the extraction of non-reproducible resources. So Norway is a great example of this. Norway is a huge petroleum-based economy, but they also tax the extraction of petroleum at a fairly high rate. And obviously, people might be more familiar with Norway for their wealth tax, but I think their tax on oil is amazing because, okay, you look at oil, you look at Norway's sovereign wealth fund. It's the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It controls almost 1% of global wealth. And how has it done that? Through rent capturing of its own natural wealth, which is through oil. They've taxed oil, they've redistributed this funding into the sovereign wealth fund, and now they've massively benefited from that. So I think that shows not even a main tenant of Georgism. The main tenant of Georgism is land value tax. So even these secondary ideas of severance and Pagovian taxes themselves have been shown to be massively useful when implemented to its fullest extent. Obviously, land value tax has never been implemented to its fullest extent. We have small rates, like as I said, in Estonia and in Denmark, and Singapore is the example everyone likes to use, or I feel Singapore is more of a pseudo Georgia system because it uses land leasing and other things. But
yeah, and I would say all the examples, including Norway that you're mentioning, are all, and I don't want to send any slander or libel, but they're very small and more centralized countries or regions, and thus their economies are a lot easier to manage to control. Whereas when you have a much bigger nation, for instance, like I know I'm biased, but like the United States, it's a lot more difficult to add these Bergovian taxes to reduce these externalities because there's
I think
just
okay,
so much economic activity.
I think you mean
It's
severance taxes. Pagovian taxes, of course, are very. I think Pagovian taxes of all taxes are one of the easiest to implement. They're essentially a VAT,
yeah, value
except
added tax.
yeah, except on
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm
harmful.
sorry.
You mean severance
It's
taxes,
been
I
a
assume.
long day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I agree. I think, I mean, land value tax, right, is implemented in Russia even to a smaller extent, but which is obviously a very large nation. But this is the other thing I wanted to discuss is the bureaucracy of it in that in the UK, right? Is we have, as I said, land value tax could replace stamp duty, but also in the UK we have council tax, which is based on the value of your house. I mean, it's all the system's there, right? We tax people based on what they physically own, right? And so why don't we just tax them based on the land value, replace council tax with land value tax, and I mean, yeah, it just makes sense, right? So I agree with what you're saying is that land value tax and Georgia systems tend to work in more centralized economies, but even these larger, like you said, with the US and even in the UK, which is still arguably quite centralized, because the US is broken down into states and because the UK is broken down into counties, which themselves already levy taxes like states in the US, you could implement land value tax at a county or a state level and then have that as a thing, and then have the state maybe have a secondary land value tax, or even have the state purely run the Pagovian and severance taxes while the land value taxes are run at a state or a county level, and then you have a full Georgia system without any of the the bureaucratic implications that come with it.
Yeah, because and I know I'm throwing this word a lot around a lot, but the bureaucratic implications and all the paperwork and all the management that has to be done is a burden on the government itself, and that is something that we're going to try to minimize because that that burden will sort of have like a ripple effect, and I'm not explaining it well, but
Yeah,
uh,
all
yeah,
good.
yeah, I'm sorry.
That's a good. That's good.
I
So
would just like to point out that Pennsylvania is actually a really good example of a land value
yeah,
tax
they
where they
have
did
a
implement a
split. They
version
have
of
a
it.
split rate tax, don't they?
Yeah, but there was I believe it's a small city in it. What's it called? I forgot the name of it. Anyway, they saw a 500% increase in building permits, and vacancy buildings dropped 80% within, I believe it was something like 10 years, 20 years. So it's been shown to work in America. It's just then obviously expanding it to further states.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the real challenge, especially because, you brought up Pennsylvania. That is a very different beast. That's a lot more urban, a lot more, centralized, I would say, than a lot of the other states. Like something like that wouldn't really work in, say, Nevada or whatever.
I think Nevada's actually quite a good example because, of course, Nevada is actually very centralized in that almost
Oh, yeah, no,
over
yeah, it's
90%
very
of the
different.
population lives in Las Vegas, which,
It is. Yeah, yeah, actually. What was I going to say? Nebraska. Nebraska would be more of an appropriate example since pretty much, it's pretty much a wasteland from my understanding. I've never been to Nebraska, but that's just what I got from
yeah,
it.
I know Nebraska
Yeah.
is primarily agricultural. I can't,
Yeah, exactly. It's
yeah.
just like farms and stuff.
Uh,
But yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Georgism application of a real, as Ben described with Pennsylvania, as I described Norway and their severance taxes, it's all worked. And Pagovian taxes are almost universal in any country, right? We have Pagovian taxes on smoking in the UK, as I use as an example. There's gambling taxes, which are a form of Pagovian taxes because you create that negative externality in mental health and things like that. So,
there's also sign taxes, which are very similar to the Pagovian taxes.
hmm. Yeah. So I mean, so Begovian taxes are sort of universally agreed upon. They're implemented everywhere. So arguably they're the least important in terms of the amount of capital they generate. Begovian taxes tend to generate a very small fraction of capital because Begovian taxes, in and of themselves, are generally generated through harmful behavior, which people tend to try not to do. Obviously, there's Pagovian taxes in the form of carbon emissions, but obviously also you can argue that's a severance tax because there's only so much oil or fuel or whatever that generates these carbon emissions, so therefore you would tax that in of itself.
Well, there's an overlap, I would say,
Yeah.
between what can be solved with the Pagovian tax, which is what you're saying, with these things with like carbon emissions and negative externalities, and things that can be reduced with a severance tax, which are, this overusage of these natural resources, and sort of the exploitation of those,
Hmm.
if you catch my drift.
Yeah, so I was just going to get into some of the benefits of severance taxes. As I said, it's very good for generating governmental wealth, as we saw in Norway. But it would also, so looking at it from a sort of an environmentalist perspective, the best way to avoid a severance tax is to recycle, because you don't get taxed on the use of these resources, you get taxed on the extraction of these resources. So suddenly it becomes massively, massively economical to recycle. And now if you tax like natural resource extraction at, I mean, it doesn't have to be a hugely high rate. All you would have to do is tax it at such a rate where extraction now becomes more expensive or as equally as expensive as the process of refining and recycling these raw resources from already pre-made goods, right? So like a good
Yeah, and
argument.
thus there's less of an incentive.
So I mean, this is sort of a more recent phenomenon with the massive increase in gold, but all of these like CPUs and things like that, their raw value in some CPUs is greater than their actual market value because CPUs have these golden pins on them. So you look at CPUs from the 90s, and now suddenly you can go and sell them to these recycling plants for more than you bought them for when they were actually, quite a valuable piece of equipment. And so that's unique to the fact that we're in a not a bubble, but you can argue we could argue semantics of this all day, but gold is massively overvalued right now, and so
Yeah.
because of that, we almost have a severance tax system where it's now actually cheaper to recycle than actually extract, which is sort of what
Uh,
you would want with a severance tax, because I mean with environmentalism, right, we're less mining, more recycling, etc., etc.
Unless
I
I've
was gonna
missed
say
something, would
something, but I can't
would you
remember.
guys not have a severance tax along with a land value tax system? Would they not? Would you not put them together to coincide?
No, exactly. But what we're arguing, so what I've just described is, I mean, Georgism as a whole, as I started the podcast saying, is a tax on non-reproducible goods. So a severance tax taxes non-reproducible goods in the form of raw resources. A land value tax um, taxes non-reproducible goods in the form of you can't create nor destroy land unless your name's Dubai. And Pagovian taxes, of course, they're sort of the wild child of Georgism in that they don't adhere to non-reproducible resources. It's more like correcting negative externalities in the economy. So that's why Pagovian taxes are arguably, not only do they generate the least capital, they also don't really. They're sort of a soft term, right? You can argue which is a negative externality and which isn't, etc. I would say a negative externality is when there's a greater societal cost than there is private cost. But again, that's quite hard to give a number to or a value to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so ultimately, I will wrap it up now. We'll wrap it up. So ultimately, right, Georgism advocates for land value tax, which decreases economic inefficiencies by increasing the proportion of money that is going towards capital and labor rather than land. Severance taxes reduce economic inefficiencies by reducing the cost for future generations because there's more natural resources, because we're mining less and focusing more on reusability, and arguably it reduces planned obsolescence, because if you have planned obsolescence, all of these resources are going to waste, and now your flat costs of production are massively higher than just building something that would just last longer. And then Pagovian taxes are also quite good in reducing these negative externalities that do haunt the government while still maintaining consumer freedom, just at the cost of, not screwing over society entirely.